Good evening. On behalf of Rice University and the Baker Institute for Public Policy, I'm pleased to welcome guests from Rice and from across Houston here. Our speaker this evening is serving two purposes. First, his presence is the result of the Baker Institute's longstanding engagement with scholars, statesmen, and business leaders from Mexico and the greater Latin American region. Under the leadership of Erica de la Garza, the Latin American Initiative sponsors the U.S.-Mexico Border Project, the biannual Americas Project, and actively seeks out opportunities for meaningful encounters between the thought leaders of Latin America, Houston, and beyond, who gather on a regular basis here at the Baker Institute. Second, Dr. Castañeda's remarks tonight serve as the keynote address for Encuentros 2008, a forum for university presidents on Mexico-U.S. relations and research initiatives. It's for that reason that we are so pleased to welcome our guests, the presidents of four Mexican universities, as well as the University of Arizona. These presidents and other top administrators from these universities have come together to discuss issues that will help shape the future relationship between these two neighboring countries, and we hope also to build a permanent forum for discussing these issues that are so important both to our border region and to our two respective countries. At Rice, we believe that sustained collaboration between institutions of higher education will bring the strengths of research and scholarship to bear on critical issues such as energy, water, and the border. The presence, as I said, of the presence of Monterrey Tech, UDEM, ITAM, and UDLA, and the University of Arizona serves as a starting point, we hope, for deep and long-term conversations between our institutions. The dialogue between us today and tomorrow can build bridges that both support ongoing conversations and collaborations, as well as help create new ones between our faculty and our students. This is not Dr. Jorge Castañeda's first visit to the Baker Institute. He was last here in 1998, and we are honored that he has agreed to be with us again. Dr. Castañeda's notable record of scholarship and statesmanship gives him unique insight into many of the issues that concern our states and countries. And I know his eloquence will enlighten and encourage those of us who believe that problems and their solutions transcend the borders. As Foreign Minister of Mexico, Dr. Castañeda was known both for being direct and for effectively advancing the Mexican agenda in bilateral relations with the United States. He is also a well-known scholar whose scholarly achievements include no fewer than 12 books, one of which is available for sale. I knew you would be embarrassed to say that. Actually, yes, from what I hear, you would have said it directly. Anyway, he is a scholar of high repute, author of 12 books and numerous articles in some of the most influential newspapers and magazines of our day. He's truly one of the most distinguished and active thinkers in the world when it comes to Mexican-U.S. relations. I know I speak on behalf of Rice University and the greater Houston community in saying what a great privilege it is to welcome you back to our campus and our city. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jorge Castañeda.
Thank you, President Ron. You're quite right. If you hadn't mentioned it, I would have. But now I have a little more time to talk about substance. It really is a pleasure to be back. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for the opportunity to be with so many good friends and colleagues in meeting we just had, and later today you have really assembled a magnificent group of Mexican academic leaders who have also had a distinguished political career. In particular, I'd like to underline the presence of my successor and good friend at the Foreign Ministry, Luis Ernesto Derbez. What I wanted to do rapidly, so we have as much time for discussion as possible, is to throw out a few ideas on perhaps three of the more important issues in the U.S. on the U.S.-Mexican agenda for the coming years. I say three of the most important because there are more, and some would certainly believe that we could touch on other questions that would be as important or as central to the agenda. But I want to do this particularly in view of the fact that we will be having a new administration in Washington very soon, and whichever of the two candidates is elected will have to address a number of issues in the U.S.-Mexican relationship, regardless of the priority that he would right now think he would like to assign to that relationship. Many of these issues pop up and they confront an American president, whatever he or she likes to do about them, and the same is true for Mexico. The three issues I'd like to address in terms, one is the question of drug enforcement, violence, and cooperation between the two countries on this issue, which is really an increasingly complicated issue in Mexico and for the United States in Mexico and along the border. Secondly, the question of immigration, which will not go away, and which both of the candidates running for president have taken very strong and progressive stances on, but then will have to deliver, I think, when they become president. And thirdly, how Mexico and the United States can in general cooperate or not in the multilateral arena, but more specifically in the ongoing division of Latin America between two broad types of governments and regimes which are confronting Mexico and the United States with challenges that the United States has faced before, but that we in Mexico have not. I'll start with the violence and drug enforcement issue, which is the one that is most present on television and in the newspapers and in the lives of millions of Mexicans and of many Americans also. We do clearly have a violence and drug enforcement and criminality or delinquency problem in Mexico. It's hard to say if it's much greater than it was in the past. Some people say it is much more serious. The numbers are more serious. Clearly, we have far more executions in Mexico today than we had 3, 5, 10, or 15 years ago. We're up to the level of roughly 100 and odd a week, which is a lot of people dying. A lot of them have mainly to do with the drug wars between the drug gangs, but it's still a lot of people dying, and there are more. Kidnappings is more difficult to say if we really have much more than before. Clearly, some of them are much more spectacular, but many of us recall, for example, in 1994, that 4 of the most distinguished businessmen of the country were kidnapped that year by a small guerrilla group in the mountains of Guerrero. It didn't receive as much publicity as the tragic death of the son of a very distinguished Mexican businessman a few weeks ago, but that's not to say that these kidnappings didn't take place before also. So there's a little bit of a discussion there as whether things really are much worse than they were before, or whether we know more about them than before, and so they look a lot worse. But in either of the two cases, very clearly, we have an enormous challenge in Mexico regarding drugs, regarding criminality, and regarding law enforcement in general. And this, by the way, is not just an issue for the United States because of the border, and because obviously part of the Mexican drug problem has to do with U.S. demand for drugs either produced in Mexico or entering the U.S. through Mexico from South America. That's part of the problem. But it also is an issue for the United States because of the border, as I said, and because, and this is something that's not talked about a great deal in the U.S. press and elsewhere, there are, by most estimates, around 1 million Americans living in Mexico, more than in any other country in the world excepting military personnel. That's a lot of people, and most of them are enormously happy, and most Mexicans are enormously hospitable to them. It's a marvelous relationship in cities like Cuernavaca, like San Miguel Allende, like Guadalajara, increasingly in other areas closer to the border in Sonora. But it's very difficult for that many people to live in a country where there is so much violence and to be totally exempt from that violence. We are going to have problems involving that issue at some point if the crime wave in Mexico continues. It would be too strange to imagine all of a sudden why would so many people be on the margin of a crime wave, which is affecting all sectors of Mexican society. So this does involve the United States, and there is an issue for the United States in terms of cooperation. President Calderón, when he took office, at least as far as public information is concerned, and that's what the only one I have access to since I left government, or since I no longer have the kind of close personal relationship that I continued to have with President Fox during the second half of his term, President Calderón decided that he had essentially to declare war on drugs and war on the drug gangs and war on the drug cartels on taking office. He decided this because there had been a great deal of violence in Mexico, throughout Mexico, the last year of the Fox administration, because a fundamental change had taken place in the Mexican drug equation, and I'll come back to this in a second, and because he thought that the Mexican state, not the government anymore, the state was losing control of national territory, and that this war had to be declared, had to be fought, and had to be won, and that he was going to do absolutely everything that was necessary in order to win it. As I said, whether there's more violence or not is an arguable proposition. What was not an arguable proposition, President Calderón was absolutely right on that front, is that the Mexican drug equation had changed. Mexico had traditionally been a country of transit for drugs. We were not consumers. This is an old discussion that goes back to the 1960s with Operation Intercept in 1969, the 70s, the death of DEA agent Camarena in the 80s. Mexico traditionally had been just a route of transshipment for drugs coming from South America, in the case of cocaine, and drugs produced in Mexico, essentially marijuana and opiates, heroin of one sort or another, produced in Mexico. We were not a consumer country. And so for many, many years, we in Mexico always argued, up to a point rightly, I think, that this was largely a problem of U.S. doing, that if the United States tackled the demand side of the equation, we could tackle the supply side, because at the end of the day, we were not a consumer country. The drugs were going to the United States. If the United States stopped consuming or reduced consumption, the Mexican drug problem would disappear. It wasn't a very noble view of life. It wasn't necessarily an accurate one, but it was a justifiable one, because at the end of the day, we were fighting a war over an American problem. An American problem which we contributed to creating, but it was an American problem. That changed. It changed sometime in the last 5 to 10 years. Mexico has become a consumer country of drugs. Not just of marijuana, which we've consumed since times immemorial, but of hard stuff. Drugs are now sold outside of schools. They are consumed in night spots. They are consumed by children. They are consumed in the large cities. They are consumed in the ski resorts. We have become a drug-consuming country, which changes things enormously for the government and for Mexican society, because it's no longer a war we are fighting for the Americans. It's a war we have to fight for ourselves. And in that sense, I think President Calderón was quite right in understanding that things had changed and that consequently the government strategy had to change. Because now we have to fight the cartels, not only who export to the U.S., but who sell drugs in Mexico. Sell them to our kids, not only to your kids, but to our kids. And by definition, governments look after their nationals and their kids, and we have to do that now. The problem, of course, is that you declare war and you go to war with an army or something like that. You have to have somebody to fight the war with, because if not, it doesn't work. You get nowhere. And President Calderón made a very courageous and bold decision, but a very arguable one also, a controversial one, which was to send the Mexican army into this war on drugs, to decide that the war had to be waged, and the only way to wage it was with the army, and the army had to leave the barracks, where traditionally the army lives in Mexico, and go out into the streets and onto the highways and into the fields and into the towns and into the shanty towns and into the slums and fight the war on drugs there. No longer just on airstrips, etc. No, go into the cities, go into the homes, go into schools. And that's a much more complicated proposition for all sorts of reasons. I'll just outline 2 or 3 of them. One of them is, of course, that in other countries of Latin America, at least, you bring the army out of the barracks. Are you sure you can send them back when you want them to go back? Always a question you have to ask in Latin America. This is not something we've had too many examples of where you can't send them back. Mexico has not been an example. We've never had that problem, at least not in the last 80 years. But it's a question you have to ask. A second question you have to ask is the human rights question, which a lot of people in Mexico and in the United States, by the way, are enormously concerned about. All armies, when they are sent to do this sort of thing, or when they're sent to do anything, i.e., fight in Iraq, violate human rights. Some do it more, some do it less, some do it massively, some do it sporadically, some punish those who violate human rights, some don't. But that's what armies do. They fight dirty. It's very difficult for them to fight clean. There are conventions, there are rules, there are punishments, but they tend to violate human rights. Now, if you have the Mexican army, which is not used to this, going into very delicate, sensitive areas of the country, you will have significant human rights violations. There's no question about that. And they have occurred, and they are occurring, and they will continue to occur, and their occurrence will increase. So that was a second question that had to be asked. And the third one was the sort of Colin Powell's, our good friend Colin Powell's old doctrine. You have to ask yourself certain questions before you go into a fight. Do you have overwhelming force? If we apply it to Iraq, we know, of course, now that the United States didn't. Do you have a definition of victory? Do you have the support of the people? And do you have an exit strategy? If we look at President Calderón's war on drugs and we ask these 4 questions, the answer to all 4 of them is categorically no. Perhaps the third one, do you have the support of the people? You might have had a positive answer at the beginning. Overwhelming force? No, he does not have it. We do not have an army that can be involved everywhere in the country all the time. A definition of victory? How do you know when you won the war on drugs? What does winning mean? Does it mean that the cartels stop fighting back? Does it mean that you've eradicated drug consumption? Does it mean that you've eradicated drug trafficking? What is the definition of victory? When do you know when you've won? Support of the people, hard to say. I think clearly the polls indicated that the president had the support of the Mexican people. When he began all of this, my impression is that the polls seem to be indicating that that support is falling off. Not dramatically, but more and more people are at least saying we're losing. They may still be saying we support the president in this war, but we're losing this war. The next step, of course, as I think Americans seem to be familiar with over history, is when people realize think you're losing a war, they stop supporting it. It's very difficult for people to support a war they think is being lost. And an exit strategy, there is no exit strategy. How do you pull the army back once you've sent it in? It's in this context that the issue of cooperation with the United States, very briefly, came up. President Calderón asked President Bush for support in this war, for shared responsibility in this war, not only on the question of U.S. demand for drugs, but on 2 questions which are fundamental. The question of arms trafficking from north to south. That is, we send the drugs, but Americans send guns to Mexico. And all of the guns, or a lot of the guns that are used by the drug traffickers, by the cartels, a lot of the violence comes from arms and weapons built and bought and sold in the United States and shipped to Mexico. So he asked for support on that, and he also asked for support on financial combat of drugs. Financing, money laundering, the banks. Where does the money go? There's a lot of money in this business. It has to move through a financial system. It has to move through banks. It has to be laundered. A lot of that is done in Mexico, and a lot is done in the United States. The Mérida Initiative, which was launched by the two presidents when they met in the Yucatan city of Mérida a year and a half ago, more or less, was finally approved by Congress, a $400 million one-time only submission, which will be repeated. I think the next president will ask for the same amount of money and probably will get the same amount of money. It's less than what was originally intended. But, and this is the crucial point here, the problem was that President Calderón had a choice. He either asked for massive U.S. support, something like what the U.S. has been doing in Colombia the last 10 years, which would have made a huge difference over time in terms of improving the Mexican army, creating a national police force so that you don't have to use the army every time you have a drug problem, training people, arming people, equipping people. But that meant the type of military cooperation between the United States and Mexico that traditional Mexican nationalism or traditional Mexican patriotism or traditional Mexican politics do not allow. It's not the law that doesn't allow it, it's popular sentiment or tradition or the elite's perception of what popular sentiment is. I wouldn't bet a whole lot of money on knowing exactly what the Mexican people think, but we do know what the Mexican elites think the people think. That we know. And most presidents prefer not to mess around with trying to find out what the people really think. They'll go along with tradition. And so President Calderón decided, consciously or not so consciously, that yes, he wanted support from the U.S., but no, not the kind of intrusive, interventionist, highly visible, high-profile support from the U.S., for example, that Presidents Pastrana and Uribe in Colombia have received from the United States since Clinton. This was not Plan Colombia. Many friends of mine in the United States who criticize Plan Colombia, rightly or wrongly, always argue, this is Bush's plan. No, Bush didn't start it. Clinton started it in 1999. You can like it or not like it, but it's not one, you can't blame this one entirely on Bush. You can blame just about everything else on Bush, rightly so, but not this one. Where will things go from here? Clearly, the level of U.S. cooperation is insufficient for Mexico to be able to win this war. Can there be more U.S. cooperation that is politically viable in Mexico and effective in the war? It doesn't seem to be the case right now. And that leaves both presidents, the new American one and President Calderón, in a very difficult situation. Because if they're not winning the war, or if Mexico's not winning the war on drugs, there's nowhere else to go. We already sent the army in. There's nobody else after the army. And we're not being able to create a national police force, which is what we need and what we should have, because it costs an enormous amount of money. It takes a long time. And we don't want to ask the type of cooperation from the United States that this entails. So we will ask for more intelligence work, and the Americans are willing to give us more intelligence sharing. And there's a lot better cooperation on that front than before. But, as the Americans say, we can tell the Mexicans where the drug guy is, but since we can't go in and get him, because we don't have enough boots on the ground in Mexico, we have to have the Mexicans go in and get him. And by the time the Mexicans go and get him, he's gone. So as much as we share intelligence, if we don't transform real-time intelligence sharing into real-time cooperation on the ground, say the Americans, it's not going to work. Now, There are going to be many more DEA agents in Mexico over the next 6 months. There's traditionally been between 50 and 60. I think the number will go well over 100, but it's still not enough. This is a huge challenge in U.S.-Mexican relations and U.S.-Mexican cooperation. To be more intrusive, more involved, more cooperative on the border with joint border patrolling, joint border peacekeeping or law enforcement, joint border cooperation, and in the hinterland of Mexico. It's an enormous challenge for President Calderon. Does he want more cooperation? Can he afford not to have it? It's an enormous challenge for the next American president. Should he force it a little bit on Mexico, or should he just wait for Mexico to ask, knowing that Mexico can't ask for a lot of things? It's an enormous challenge. That's one. The second one is immigration. Immigration is not going to go away, as I said, in the same way the 12 million Mexicans are not going to go away, the ones who are in the United States. 6 million Mexicans with papers, the 6-odd million Mexicans without papers, they're not going to go away. The war of attrition that the conservatives and that border enforcement and ICE and Secretary Chertoff seem to be waging is not going to work. Some people will return home, clearly. Some people will not come, although they intended to come. But at least if we go by any historical perspective of the last 100 years, because this did not start yesterday, this began well over a century ago, people keep coming from Mexico to the United States as long as they find jobs here. And they still find jobs here. And they still find far better paying jobs here than in Mexico, particularly because you say, well, yes, but there's a recession in the United States. Sure, except there's also a recession in Mexico, because the two economies are so linked that if you have a recession in the U.S., you have a recession in Mexico. So maybe it's a little more difficult to find a job in the United States, but it's also a lot more difficult to keep a job or to find a job in Mexico. So they're going to keep coming. So what is the next American president going to do about this? And what ways can the two governments cooperate on this issue, which is a tremendously prickly one. It gives consuls like Don Carlos here headaches indefinitely. It makes the foreign minister's job a very difficult one, and it makes being president of Mexico or the United States in relation with each other extraordinarily sensitive and complicated. My sense, and I'm very optimistic about this, is that the United States continues to be, at the end of the day, a very generous, hospitable, noble nation that understands that it cannot placate and accommodate and go by the nativist, xenophobic, often racist, and always ugly reactions that we are seeing in many parts of the United States. And one of the proofs of this is that despite the huge number of very nativist candidates that were out there in the primaries, and despite the noise made by the Lou Dobbses and Rush Limbaughs and everybody else, the two candidates who came out standing both voted for immigration reform, both were in favor of legalization and a guest worker program, both committed themselves, and in the case of McCain, drafted the legislation, and both have rejected systematically this notion of deporting everybody, throwing everybody out, and closing the doors. And these were the guys who were elected by millions and millions and millions of American voters in the primaries. They didn't vote for Tancredo, they didn't vote for Romney, they didn't vote for Huckabee, they didn't vote for the people who were against this immigration. They voted for two very reasonable, very centrist, very moderate stances on immigration, McCain's and Obama's. Obama has the Chicago Mexican community roots, which are important. He's sensitive to the issue. He knows the Mexican community in Chicago. It's the oldest Mexican community, in a sense, in the country. It's not Los Angeles. That's another problem. And Obama will have that problem, but if he wins. But it's a problem of a different caliber. And McCain knows the issue very well because he's from Arizona, because he's dealt with it, he's studied it, he's drafted legislation, he's worked with Kennedy on it. So we will have a president of the United States who understands the issue, who is committed to reform, and hopefully will try and get it done. Now, what lessons can be learned from the mistakes that both governments, and I'm certainly responsible for my mistakes, and I'm sure Luis Ernesto is for his, and maybe even for mine. But what did we learn from these 6 years on both sides? I think on the U.S. side, very clearly, it's very important that the next president understand if he's going to get this done, it's got to be done quickly and soon. If he lets opposition build up over months and years, if he lets the other guys organize, if he waits for the perfect moment to send legislation up, if he waits too long, something else will happen and it will be defeated. Bush started off his administration committed to immigration reform, committed to an agreement with Mexico, committed to doing a series of things. I continue to believe enormously in the sincerity of his commitment to that goal early on in the administration. But then, obviously, 9/11 got in the way, then Iraq got in the way, then the elections got in the way, then all sorts of things got in the way, and by the time he got around to it, in 2006 and 2007, he was too weak a president even to deliver the right wing of his own party. Clinton delivered enough Democrats in '93, his first year in office, to get NAFTA passed, essentially with Republican votes. Bush, by 2006 and 2007, was no longer able to deliver enough Republican votes to get immigration passed with the Democrats. The first thing is do it quickly. If not, it won't happen. On the Mexican side, I think we have to be much more forceful. And the Mexican government in 2005 or 2006 was very clear about this in a full-page ad bought in many American newspapers about our commitment to regulating the remnant flow of undocumented workers into the United States and applying our laws if there is a deal. It's very difficult to say this because any one of you could ask me, well, wait a second, aren't you saying that you have to apply your laws? Well, don't you have to apply the law anyway, whether there is a deal or there is no deal? In principle, yes. In real life, no. We have laws on the books in Mexico that say you can only exit Mexican territory through approved points of exit and only in possession of all of the documentation required by Mexico and by the country of destination. The law says so. But it's the same old story that we've been hearing since the 1940s. If we place the Mexican police or the Mexican army on the border to stop people from leaving, you know who the first guys to leave will be? The soldiers and the policemen who we put on the border. They'll be the first ones to go. So it is a real complication. Any Mexican government who wants to curtail or limit or dissuade people from leaving can only do so if it can show that in exchange for that, it obtained a very significant agreement and improvement in the situation of Mexicans in the United States and of Mexicans who will keep coming to the United States. And Mexico has to be more forceful on that. More clear, more specific, more explicit, and more committed. But on the understanding that there is a deal. And this is always very tricky territory here. It's very dangerous because you always run the risk that the Americans will say, well, wait, why don't you start doing this now? And that way we'll show the nativists that we can cooperate on this. And once you do this for a while, then we'll legalize everybody. Then we'll create a guest worker program for 350,000 people a year instead of 45 or 50,000. And then you're stuck. Because if the Americans say that to you, what do you answer back? Say, no, sorry, we're not going to do that until there is a deal. You don't want to be too explicit about these things because it's very difficult to manage in a negotiation when you have 100 other issues on the agenda that are getting in the way every single day, because it's not the only issue. For me, it's the most important one, but it's not the only one. I hope that these are at least two lessons the two governments learned from these 6 years or 8 years. I hope that the Mexican government continues to be active and forceful in pushing for immigration reform, in pushing for an immigration agreement in the United States. I don't think it should give up. I don't believe in the antibody backlash theory that the more Mexico gets involved, the worse it is. I think it's just as bad getting involved or not, but if you get involved and you put up the good fight, you can convince some people. If you do nothing, you will convince no one. And finally, the last challenge to conclude, the question of Latin America and in general cooperation between Mexico and the United States in the international arena. As I'm sure many of you have followed, there are all sorts of exciting things happening in Latin America. Some are good, some are not so good, some are bad. It depends on your viewpoint, but there's a lot of things happening. One of the things happening, of course, is that Latin America has now begun to grow again, has been growing at high levels for 5 consecutive years. We had not seen this in Latin America for 30 years. Part of it is driven by commodities, the high price of commodities. Growth rates will probably begin to slacken off soon because commodity prices are falling. But countries are growing at 6, 7, 8% per year, not Mexico, unfortunately, but others are. And this has begun to change the landscape in Latin America. Latin America has become and has remained essentially democratic now for a longer period of time than ever, or at least in my memory. You have elections, people go and vote, the guys who get more votes win, the guys who get less votes lose, even in Mexico. It used to be the other way around. And things now, the way you get power in Latin America is at the ballot box. So there have been some enormously positive developments in Latin America. This has led to the appearance of a series of searches for different solutions to the same problems. Because despite the growth, poverty persists. Despite the growth, inequality persists. Despite the growth, violence, crime persists, drugs persist. And so different people, different leaders, different parties, different electorates are looking for different solutions to these same old problems. And some of them, I think the right way, are looking for solutions essentially on the same road. The type of market economics, representative democracy, globalization, generally getting along with the Americans more or less, and others are looking along a different route, the route of a more interventionist state in the economy, less market economics, a more authoritarian temptation, at least, to remain in power indefinitely, to control more and more areas of society, of the economy, of everything, of a constant confrontation with the United States, and of social policies when there is money, can be, at least in the short term, very effective, but in the long term, perhaps are not so effective. And Latin America is divided between these two searches. In the first group, in the first line, you have Mexico, you have most of Central America, you have Colombia, you have Peru, you have Chile, you have Uruguay, you have Brazil. Countries, some of which have right-of-center governments, like Mexico, like Colombia, some of which have left-of-center governments, like Peru, like Uruguay, like Chile, like Brazil. But fundamentally, they follow the same policies. Policies that now, finally, at long last, seem to be working. And it took a whole lot of time. And it's still too long, and they're still not working well enough, and it's still taking too much time. But finally, they seem to be working. The other side of the dividing line is, of course, made up of Cuba, Venezuela, Bolivia, Nicaragua, Argentina, sort of, Ecuador, certainly. And they are all tempted to seek a different path. When they say another world is possible, they mean it. They believe so sincerely. They think that they can solve these problems that Latin America continues to have with the states taking over the economy again, particularly natural resources, by establishing a much more authoritarian political system, because you have to remain in office in order to get things done. If not, you can't get them done. You can't fix everything in 4 years or 6 years. So you got to be in power for a long time. Maybe not as long as Fidel, maybe not half a century, but a little bit longer than most people. You got to stay around. And you can't stay around democratically. It's not that easy. So you have to find ways to stick around for a long period of time. You need to confront the United States to mobilize your base, but also because you think that only with a much more distant relation with the United States can you get things done.
And so you have two sides in Latin America. And there is an ideological war, or an ideological battle, and a political battle going on between these two sides of the region. And Mexico and the United States have a very complicated but significant role to play in that battle. The United States, why? Well, because it's part of the battle. It's either the savior or the scourge, but in either of the two cases, it's present. And Mexico, because Mexico is a country that has huge influence, mainly political and ideological, much more than economic, in Latin America. What Mexico says or does counts. About as much, perhaps a little less, a little more, than what the Brazilians say or do. And so Mexico and the United States have to decide what they're going to do in the next few years as this ideological and political battle heats up, because it will heat up. It is already heating up. Chavez continuously finds ways of picking fights with all sorts of people. The most recent fight he picked is with Mexico. He nationalized all of the cement companies in Venezuela, but he paid the French and the Swiss, but doesn't want to pay the Mexican company, which is the biggest one. Now, we're not used to that in Mexico. We're used to be the ones who nationalize American companies, not who get our companies nationalized by the Venezuelans. We're not used to that. We should actually probably come and speak to people in the United States about what you do when this happens to you. But the fact is that the president of Cemex and the shareholders and the Mexican government and everything are in a little bit of a quandary. What in the world do you do with this? You turn the other cheek. There's a lot of cheeks. You got a big red cheek. President Calderon's got a big red cheek for how many times he's turned it on Chavez. You can't continue to do this endlessly. On the other hand, you want to pick a fight with Chavez over a cement company? Because then he can go after the other Mexican companies, because it turns out that we also have huge investments had in steel and continue to have investments in soft drinks, in bread, in flour, and in all sorts of things. There's all sorts of Mexican companies in Venezuela. But forget the flour and the arepas that the Venezuelans eat with Mexican flour. What happens, what does Mexico do if the confrontation between the United States and Venezuela, because of Iran, for example, reaches new dimensions, including a cutoff of oil, or a rise of prices in oil, or the U.S. nationalizing Citgo, right here? These are very complicated issues, and they're challenges that the next president of the United States and President Calderon will have to face. Do they want to work together in the Latin American arena, defending the ideas that both share and policies that work? Want to work together at the Security Council, the United Nations, where Mexico will be reelected now as of January 1st. Do we want to work together there? Do we want to work together in the OAS? Do we want to work together on the most important event that will take place in Latin America in the next 2 or 3 years, which is the Cuban succession or transition, whatever you want to call it? In Mexico, and I'll stop with this, for a long time we had our own Fidel. It was Fidel Velázquez, the labor leader. And he reached the summit of the labor movement in the 1930s and died in 1997. So he was around for a long time too. But he was around for so long that people began talking about him in sort of different ways, with a certain different view of things. And most Mexicans always referred to the future, never saying, cuando muera Fidel. Said, si muere Fidel. If Fidel Velázquez, of course, I'm referring to, dies. I don't know if this is applicable to Cuba or not. I have no idea. But I do know that at some point, things will change in Cuba. Do the two countries want to work together on that, or each one follow its own way? So as you see, between drug enforcement, between immigration, Cuba, Venezuela, the OAS, etc., the next president of the United States has a lot of work to do just dealing with Mexico, and Mexico has a lot to do just dealing with the United States. And I hope that the Baker Institute, Rice University, and the group you've put together, President, can work together on all these issues. We need your help and we need your support. Thank you very much.
We'll take a couple questions. Would you prefer to call on people yourself, or?
Okay, we have time for some questions.
Yeah, I was wondering if you can comment on Canada and the whole equation of Latin America,
In Latin America or with Mexico?
you know, the role that it plays.
Since I can recall, and my colleague will correct me, we've always wanted to engage the Canadians in the NAFTA triangular relationship, and they have always been very reluctant. The way they put it when they're frank and open about it is, look, we have our own relationship with the Americans, and the last thing we want to do is pollute it with the type of relationship that you have with the Americans. When they're being frank and honest, that's what they say. Whether they're right or wrong, it's hard to say. Obviously, we would always want them to drag them in on all sorts of issues, but they're very reluctant, and I don't think that that will change a great deal in the months or years to come. I just don't see. They're perhaps on security issues, perhaps on environmental issues, global warming, climate change, perhaps, but on the sort of bread and butter stuff, my impression is that they will continue to be very reluctant.
We have read that probably because of agricultural subsidies in the United States, the NAFTA has brought ruins to Mexican farmers, or some Mexican farmers. What's the story there, really?
Well, I mean, there's been a lot of ruin among Mexican farmers for a long, long time, whether it's NAFTA or U.S. Farm Bill, a new Farm Bill. I mean, this is an ongoing problem in Mexico, and it's a problem we haven't addressed. Figure it this way. We have, at this stage, it's probably about 16 to 17% of the economically active population still in the countryside, when agriculture's contribution to GDP is about 5 or 6%. So we have, in relation to GDP per capita, Mexico has far more people living in the countryside than it should, in that sense. And we still have 12 million in the United States. So there is an issue there that if Mexican peasants are displaced, as they have been, and continue to be displaced, a lot of them will go to Mexico City, a lot of them will go to Monterrey, a lot will go wherever, and a lot of them will go to Los Angeles and Houston and New York, etc. Is NAFTA to blame for this, I think, or U.S. Farm Bill? Frankly, I don't think so. It's quite possible that the right type of protection and supports were not set up, that more should have been done, that Mexico did not prepare, particularly for the 2007 opening on corn and milk and beans. But at the end of the day, this is a process that has been going on for a long time, and if anything, it's slower than it should be. By historical standards of other countries, more people should have left the land in Mexico already than they have. It's not the Farm Bill, and it's not NAFTA, though. You know, they're easy scapegoats, but if it were that simple, we could fix it.
Well, the big catchphrase in Mexico right now is energy reform. So how do you think that would influence Mexican-American relations?
Well, it really, I mean, how would I put it? In a different world and with different governments and in different societies, one can see the logic of, given the integration of the two economies and the two societies, one can see the logic of having Mexico, the United States, and Canada having a sort of North American energy policy, framework, market, etc. And instead of the United States continuing to import roughly 15% of its imports of oil from Venezuela, from the Gulf, from Saudi Arabia, with all of the complications that that entails, import more from Mexico if Mexico can produce more, which right now it can't. Now, maybe we can't produce more because we don't have any in the deep waters of the Gulf, or maybe we can't produce more because we have the oil there, but we can't get it out. Most people tend to think that there is a lot of oil in the deep waters of the Gulf of Mexico. But as a matter of fact, and still you start poking holes in the ground, and at 10,000 feet, each hole costs a lot of money. We don't really know. The logic of the energy reform bill that President Calderon sent up was to allow Pemex to be able to obtain financing, private financing, in order to poke those holes in the ground under the sea at 10,000 feet. Frankly, I don't think this reform will allow that to happen. It's better for this reform to be approved than not approved, but I don't think it will have that kind of impact. The United States has been very discreet on the matter, has not gotten involved, rightly so. But again, the issue then is what kind of future do we want to view and to present to our two societies of the type of cooperation between our two countries? If people in Mexico continue to think that the worst thing that can happen to Mexico is to sell oil to the United States, and people in the United States continue to think that the worst thing that can happen to the United States is for more Mexicans to come to the United States, it's very difficult to move the two countries forward in the direction of greater cooperation.
You mentioned in your third point that Mexico is in the first group with Brazil, the United States, in pursuing democracy, and I think I may be overstating this, capitalism and so forth, rather than socialistic policies. Based on the 2006 election and how close it was between the PRD and the Panistas, do you think there was a risk, and do you think there may be a risk in future 4 years that Mexico could be in the other group?
Oh, I think there certainly was a huge risk in 2006, and unfortunately there continues to be one. The risk being not that the left wins. That I don't think in itself is a risk. On the contrary, the risk is the type of left we have in Mexico as opposed to the type of left, for example, that is governing in Brazil or governing in Chile or governing in Uruguay and other countries. That's the real issue. I think Mexico logically should be governed from the center left. It's the type of country like Brazil and others where, you just look at the numbers and you look at the people and you look at the landscape and you say, this is a country that should be governed from the center left. But the problem is that the kind of left we have in Mexico, one, makes it almost impossible for it to win an election, and two, if it wins one, make it impossible for it to govern. Now, how can you reform the Mexican left? Well, it doesn't want to be reformed. It doesn't want to reform itself, and the government, logically enough, doesn't want to help reforming it either. Some people have asked President Calderon, say, well, why don't you help in transforming the left into a modern left? And I imagine his reply generally is, hey, wait a second, I work for the PAN, I was elected by the PAN, and my business is to get the PAN reelected, not to invent a modern left in Mexico that will displace my party. That's not what I do for a living. So it's a very difficult challenge for Mexico, but the danger is there. And I think it would be very serious for Mexico, of course, but for the United States also. Again, I insist, not that the left win, but that that kind of left win and take power.
I'm from El Paso, and we've seen all the violence in Juarez. And earlier this week, it's all over the news that the U.S. received intelligence that there was going to be an influx of the drug lords were going to allow their hitmen to cross the border. Do you think that an influx of spillover violence would change the level of involvement of the United States?
I know it's something that is causing a great deal of concern both in Washington and at the U.S. Embassy in Mexico. I imagine it's also causing concern in the foreign ministry in Mexico. It should. If it doesn't, it should. It's a very complicated issue because the first step is for the hitmen to go after, for the gang wars to spill over. It's not that they'll go after Americans. They will settle their scores among themselves on the U.S. side. We don't know as a fact that this is happening or that will happen. It's more speculation, I think, and sort of informed gossip more than really hard intelligence, because I don't imagine the cartels going around saying all these things or telling, having a beer with a DEA agent and say, well, guys, if ship up or shape, whatever, that's not going to happen. But the risk is either that it spills over or that the violence begins affecting Americans in Mexico. This is why I insisted so much on this question of the 1 million people and the 22 million tourists. It's difficult to imagine why nothing would happen. And then we get into a lot of trouble.
In the same sense, don't you think that in order for the Mexican government to be successful against the Mexican cartels, the U.S. government should start applying its technology and going after the distribution networks that are in the States? Because I don't believe the Mexicans control the distribution in the States. Or do they?
No, I agree with you. I don't think they do. I don't know who controls the distribution networks in the States, but I don't imagine it's certainly not only Mexicans. And I agree with you completely that the United States could do far more on all of the front you mentioned, the one I mentioned regarding arms trafficking from north to south, the financial and money laundering issues. On all of these issues, I think President Calderon has been quite right in demanding that the U.S. do more. Now, the next question is it going to do more? Can you base a strategy on hoping that it does more? Or do you hope it does more, but you have a strategy based on knowing that it probably will not? I mean, what are the chances of changing gun laws in the United States, in particular in the state of Texas? I think you know more about that than I do, but my impression is that it's not likely. So you're right. I mean, it's a real issue, but can you have a strategy that depends on that? No. And I don't think President Calderon's strategy depends on that. I think he says so because it's important to say so. It's important to keep pushing and all the time keep asking for Washington to do more. But I don't think he believes that he will actually get a change to occur, for example, in gun legislation in the United States or in Texas in particular.
Yes, I want to ask regarding Mexican policy, and specifically the Mexican way of thinking. Obama, with his favorite word change, or his second favorite word change, talks about change coming from the bottom up. And I think President Calderon might be wise if he engaged the Mexican people. They changed some philosophy. Corruption used to be called the unofficial institution of Mexico, where common folks were practicing corruption, but they didn't call it corruption because they were practicing it. But when it was done in the government, then it was corruption. That change, can we get that change in Mexico?
I think we all thought that would began in the 90s. We particularly thought that in 2000, when finally the ruling party was voted out of office and rotation in power took place and Fox became president, that it would happen. A lot of people thought that with the advent of the left in 2006 it would happen. And the fact of the matter is that Mexican society remains incredibly disorganized, apathetic, and non-participatory. In comparison to countries with similar levels of development, you're not comparing to Norway. Countries in Latin America with the same GDP per capita levels, the same literacy levels, the same educational levels, etc., have societies that are far more participatory than Mexico's is. In Mexico, we have had 200 years of a lot of state and not much society, and it's very difficult to turn that around, and our society doesn't get involved. People don't join clubs, they don't join associations, they don't belong to unions, they don't go to church. They're very Catholic, but they don't go to church. The rich don't give money away. The poor don't organize. I mean, Mexican society is remarkably still indifferent or apathetic in relation to politics, in relation to organizing, in relation to fighting for its rights, for what it believes in. And so you end up in this very paradoxical situation where you ask the government to push society to get organized. But of course, if the government organizes society, it does no good anymore. So it's a very complicated, we haven't been able to face this. I'm more involved now in citizens' issues and things like that. It's extraordinarily difficult to move Mexican society. It is much less organized and participatory than almost any Latin American society is. I insist, I'm not comparing it to other countries, to just our own points of comparisons. People, it's a very, strangely, a very individualistic country. Taking it from Octavio Paz, but modernizing, wrote 30 years ago now, almost 30 years ago, 25 years ago, that strangely enough, and this was from the early 80s, Mexicans were very good at individual sports, the Olympics or what have you, and terrible at collective ones. This was true 25 years ago, and still is. We're good at boxing. We're good now at Taekwondo. It's the only thing we win medals on, but at least we win some. We're good on a few other individual sports, tennis, etc. We're terrible at soccer, terrible at baseball, terrible at every collective sport there is. Mexico, strangely enough, we're extraordinarily individualistic society, but without the adventuresome nature of American individualism or Brazilian individualism. And so we have this strange situation where we have a society that's not organized, that's not participatory, that's not combative, that doesn't go out and fights for its rights. And at the same time, Mexican individuals who are incredibly resourceful, incredibly imaginative, incredibly skillful at addressing and solving their individual problems, and actually making a lot of headway in the solution of their individual problems. If we could put all of that skill and resourcefulness and intelligence into more collective enterprises, perhaps we'd have a different and better country. Thanks a lot again.
That was really wonderful and provocative. Before we close, I would like to acknowledge the presence of the Consul General of Mexico to the United States and Houston, Ambassador Gonzalez Magallon. We are extraordinarily fortunate here in Houston to have so many consulates, and we at Rice have benefited in particular, and especially as we attempt to build stronger relationships with Mexico. The relationship with the Consul General has been particularly important, so we want to thank you for all you've done. Please join me once more in thanking Dr. Castañeda for a truly memorable talk this evening. Thank you. I especially like the way you try to make your views very subtle.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Well, I tried to.